everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Surya mentioned, this is the investment panel around where the investments are going on in Industrial IoT. My name is Abhishek Shukla. I'm with GE Ventures. I also have Michael and Toshi. I'll let them introduce themselves, and then we can get started.
Michael Young with Caterpillar Ventures. We invest quite a bit in the IoT space, and also it's a huge part of our business in terms of supporting our customers. So been very active in this space.
So my name is Toshiya Otani. I am a co-founder and managing director of a firm called TransLink Capital. In a nutshell, we've been around for about 10 years, but we try to bridge our Asian corporates with the innovation here in Silicon Valley. Happy to be here.
Great. Thanks, Michael and Toshi. I just wanted to set some context about IoT in general. You guys have been here listening to different areas, including Trimble just now. IoT means different things to different people. For some people it means connectivity and narrowband IoT and mesh networking. For some people it's toasters and thermostats. For some people it's jet engines like us. For this session I will try and focus a little bit more on enterprise and industrial IoT. And with that, let's begin. In fact, I want to be a little bit controversial to begin with and say investment in consumer IoT is dead. What do you guys think? I'll start with you, Mike.
Yeah, from a Caterpillar perspective, we hope so, right? Consumer isn't part of our business, but what we really see is an emergence of the industrial IoT, and the fact that a lot of the startups are seeing that there's a lot of money to be made in real productivity that can be gained from IoT in the industrial sector. So I wouldn't say that IoT and consumer is dead, but let's just say the IoT and industrial is booming.
Toshi?
Well, I'm more the enterprise guy on the team, but I do have partners working on the consumer side as well. So I probably shouldn't stand up here and say consumer is dead. Having said that, though, I think they're fairly different models. If you look at the consumer side, it's very much hits-driven, and there's a different model to be had versus the industrial side. And I think, potential-wise, I would argue that I would agree with Mike. The industrial side has much more potential to grow into something significant moving forward. But I would probably argue that it isn't really dead, but it's just very different models of go-to-market and everything. And hence, from an investor perspective, it's really hard to kind of lump them into one word IoT.
That's a great point. In fact, that's segue into the next question. When you think about IoT, what does that mean to you? And if you can just also give an audience an example of what's the best use case of an IoT which you have come across, business model.
That's a really good question. We kind of define IoT as a combination of software and services and hardware through connectivity, right? So if you really broaden it to the essence, that's probably how we look at it. And so by definition, if you look at it most successful IoT company, you could bring up names like Nest and some others, but I would argue that you can probably say that this could be considered, right? iPhone could be considered as a very successful IoT company. It fits the bill that we just talked about. But I do think that in terms of success, I think the key is you have a software component and services component. You have a hardware component, and ideally you're making money off of both, right? That's easily said than done, because if you think about just as a typical consumer, would I buy a $100 device and still pay $10 subscription fees? If you think about it that way, it's a pretty tall order, right?
That's right.
And therefore, the business model becomes really important. And you wouldn't imagine how many companies come through our door, and probably yours as well, that say, hey, we're going to sell this device and we're going to make $100 a year off of it. I mean, it's easily said than done. So we've learned that, the nitty-gritties of the business model and how you go to market and such are very important on both the consumer side and the industrial side.
That's right, yeah.
No, I agree with what Toshi said, and I'm glad you asked this question today versus 2 years ago, because it was a lot harder to figure out what IoT was 2 years ago, right? But we've kind of segmented into 3 pieces. The first piece is the network and the sensors to get information off of machines and get it into the cloud, and then really you're not going to have a lot of partners there, right? You're not going to have 1,000 devices. You're not going to have 1,000 different mesh network protocols. So you're going to have partner with 1 or 2, 3 type people in that sector. And then you got the middle space, which is the management of the data. You get all this data, you pull it into the cloud, you got to come up with an idea, some insights.
Yeah.
And so the whole data analytics and managing that data, we look at as part of IoT. And again, you're not going to have a whole bunch of partners in that area, right? You're going to have software and you're going to, have data and you're going to manage it relatively similarly. But then you get to the third piece, which is how do you take those insights back to your customers? And then you end up with hundreds of applications. I mean, even in our situation where you may have an application for a mine site, you may have an application for specifically just for a mining truck, right? You may have them for construction, you may have for an oil rig where you guys are on there, with a pump or a drill rig, we're on there with an engine. I mean, so there's just thousands of applications on that side. And so we look at our investments, and certainly a lot of our investments are on that application side, because that's where the business model's at, right? That's where the money's going to be made. There's a lot of cost in accepting data and managing data, and the hope is, is that application that actually provides productivity and insights to your customers is where you're going to get paid.
Yeah, exactly. And just to add on that, what GE is seeing is, for example, if I take an example of aviation and the jet engines, we sell a lot of services around getting you from point A to point B. It's not about buying a jet engine itself. It's about getting you there. And what is involved to the point which Michael made is about 2 terabytes of data of every hour of flight while the jet engine is moving around, and some part of that data is not even connected. So, it doesn't make sense for you to get all that data, stream it to the cloud without even knowing how much bill you have already racked up, and then go on from there. So what we are seeing, and a lot of my investment areas these days are a lot of edge computing, to do as much as compute as you can, get the relevant bits and bytes out into the into the cloud. For us, it is the Predix cloud, and get back those analytics. And essentially, that is where the value we're thinking about as well. So that kind of brings me to the next question. Within the value chain, which you described, where do you feel right now are the opportunities, or where you feel you are looking at most pitches these days?
It's interesting because I guess this panel is about IoT, but I do think that it's very broad, and I do think that if you start chopping it up, especially on the industry side, right? Ultimately, I think it becomes much more vertically oriented, right? Many things get more vertically oriented, right? The sensors and the infrastructure may be similar, but the value has to come at each specific vertical. So it could be aerospace, or it could be more industrial oriented, but I think it has to become, at that point, the application side have to become much more vertically oriented. And I think the value is much more on that side.
That's right.
Having said that, though, the infrastructure components and the sensors that supply the data into it have to progress as well. I'll give you one example in our portfolio, which is in digital health in general. But we've invested along the supply chain, but we did invest in a sensor company that, without going into too much detail, can collect heartbeat and potentially blood pressure non-contactless, right? That, if you look at IoT, specifically wearables in general, there is no innovation because the sensors are so limited, right? Every sensor in every device out there is fairly similar. So that's just an example that to collect some data, you need to invest in this area. But ultimately, I think the value is on the side where the technology touches the business. And, that's the part that I believe as an investor will create the most value.
Most value, right, yeah.
I don't know, it's one of the solutions that has to happen is, I absolutely agree, it's going vertical. But an airline, okay, an owner of an airplane doesn't want to log on to 14 platforms, right? They don't want to log on to the GE platform. They don't want to log into the next guy. A guy who's running a construction site, who's running a drill platform. And what I think what we have to figure out is how can you get 14 applications that manage a construction site, for example, and get one platform. I mean, remember a year ago it was like, oh, don't talk about a platform, right, anymore. It's out of vogue. But the answer is we have to figure out how you can have a platform to serve the industry.
That's right.
And at the same time, everybody gets paid, right? So, the customer wants productivity data, maybe they want fuel data, maybe they want material data that has nothing to do with Caterpillar, right? But you have to figure that out and put it together in such a way. So I think what you'll start to see in the next couple of years is platforms that will emerge. And I think there will be partnerships that will emerge to get a critical mass so you can drive that merger. So I think that's the direction we're headed, and certainly one of the things we keep an eye on in terms of investing is what will those critical platforms be?
I have a hint for you.
Yeah.
It's going to be Predix.
Yeah. No, I can't even respond to that.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little bit biased on that, but that's exactly right. It's given the kind of value which the most important piece of IoT is the T, which is the things, and the higher the value of those things which are connected, it becomes a lot of much bigger of a platform war rather than just individual applications, and how do you stitch them. So with that, if I am a CEO or I'm an entrepreneur looking to build a company in IoT or enterprise or industrial IoT, what would you recommend to that person? Toshi, maybe I'll start with you.
Oh, it's a good question. So like I said up front, our firm looks at pretty much evenly across consumer and industrial. And less so on the industrial side, but more so on the consumer side, there are companies that come in and present, well, we'll get this many eyeballs, right?
Yeah.
It's still, shockingly, in this day of age, there are still companies that come with that approach. On the industrial side, less so, but, I think that the key is, how do you make money? And it sounds like, duh, right? But you would be shocked how many companies come in and say, this is the plan. And I'm like, so how do you make money? Right?
We spend money, we don't make money.
Exactly. And it's easy, again, it's easy to say, let's say I'll give you a particular example especially in IoT. So I'll give this hardware away and I'll make $10 off subscription. I'm sure you hear this a lot, right? I think it's a bad idea, personally, right? You have to make money off of the hardware and then figure out how to get the subscription, right? I think some companies have figured out you don't have to always go to the same customer. The data's valuable enough, you get money from others, right? That business model, I think, is really essential.
That's right.
And thinking about it through before you say, well, this is a really cool device, and I can charge whoever, GE for $100 million, there's a lot of thought that goes behind that, right? And I think thinking through that, I would recommend, having a thoughtful plan around that is essential for at least us.
Yeah, and that's great.
I think whether it's an IoT or any startup, right, you have to solve a problem. And in this case, you really need to get close to your industrial customers, right, to figure out what their problems are.
That's right.
We invested in an IoT company that's put sensors on mining buckets, right? And a huge problem in the mining industry is processing material that doesn't have any ore or copper in it, right? And here's a guy who figured out how to put sensors on a bucket, so when you pick up the dirt, it tells you right then and there whether there's enough copper in that bucket to process it, or should you just go ahead and throw it away today?
Yes.
And I would say that's truly IoT today, right? And you start to understand where in the mine you're at, and can truly add millions of dollars to their bottom line, right, by solving problems that they have. And so to some degree, I think you need a little bit more industrial knowledge, a little bit vertical knowledge to do this, but I wouldn't say in 100% of the cases, because sometimes you need to look at a problem completely differently. But,
that's right.
But you need to understand what the customer problem is, and then how do you solve it? It's just critical.
I think one thing, building on what Mike just said, especially here in Silicon Valley, right? You tend to go for the sexy object.
Yeah.
Especially in, I'm preaching to the choir here, but like the example you gave, right? The technology may not be the sexiest thing. It could be a commodity, but there may be a lot of value for, the industrial customer.
And it's great, this company that we're speaking of, so they're negotiating with their customers, right? And the customer's like, yeah, I'll take 7 sensors, how much do those cost? And it's like, no, we're saving you $10 million.
Yes.
And we want 20% of that. Forget about $1,000 a sensor. We want a contract for $150,000 a month. And to be honest, they're getting it because they are saving $10 million a year. And so it's that type of product, right, that you can connect to a platform that will change the world, right, in the industrial world.
Exactly, and some of the examples, in fact, one of the guys I was talking to, he's running a deep learning company, and everything these days is artificial intelligence and deep learning. So this guy comes up and he's like, yeah, I can distinguish between cats and dogs. Everybody can do that. And our application of the same technology is about, okay, can you tell me the corrosion on the blades of a turbine? It's used the same image recognition, but then it's the same deep learning application. So it's all about the context to what you guys were just mentioning. I guess we are just at the end of the session. I'll probably leave time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if there are any. In the life cycle, it's actually the entire IoT life cycle. So it's a lot of data which needs to be processed. So think about Spark streaming, but at that kind of a scale. Also, the compute needs to happen there. What compute needs to happen in what compute environment? How do I also make sure the jet engine is made up of sub-components, each of which are secured? For example, you can use, again, in getting back into the industry jargon, you can use blockchain to do so. So secure all of these. So there are multiple aspects within that area where we are investing. And happy to have a conversation after this. Any other questions? Yes. So the question is, where do you think there's a value if somebody is exploring IoT for healthcare devices? Wearables, sorry.
Yeah, wearables. So, we have a medical investments and wearable investments. I think in that particular field, it's a pretty wide open field. You would think that, a lot of things in hospitals or whatnot are connected, but the data actually in that world is, it appears to be consolidated, but it really isn't, right? I'll give you an example. We have an investment in a company that's in the sleep field, right? Shockingly, sleep is a big market, but the data collected from some of these sleep centers is just basically thrown away. And so, collecting that data in one place, analyzing it is a start, right? And so this is the other thing. I think that, there's a timeline, right? And if you're too early as a startup, you basically die because you don't get there. And so you need to figure out the right timeline of where, these things are progressing. And, because timing is crucial, right? You can have the greatest idea, the market isn't there. Pulling a market forward is something that it's just impossible for a startup to do. So you have to be at the right time. So, where are the pockets of opportunity? I think, again, if you look at closer to the customer, data collection, the platform ideas, where are those pockets, right? You have, sleep, you have, diabetes, you have a bunch of different areas. So finding those pockets that are further along enough that are receptive to those ideas, I think are key. And I'd be happy to go into more detail.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael and Toshi.
Thank you.
This concludes our panel. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.